I think I broke
Unlike
a fiddle
Uncle
player.
Bonsai, we don't have to pay for this by the inch.
Yes. They have a live recording where they mention that.
Well, this is it. This might be the hardest chapter in the whole book. Maybe. I have in the past managed to get through this one, but struggled a bit with the next one. At any rate, Oxen and Circe are the two toughest chapters, in my opinion, in the whole book. But on the bright side, you've made it this far, and I think if you made it this far, you're going to make it all the way. In fact, by now, you might even be a little bit into it and ready for a little punishment. You can take the pain. James Heffernan says that the chapter is about birth, and certainly if women can take it, the pain of childbirth, and Mina Purefoy can take it. She's been in labor for 3 days. We can take it and make it through this chapter. Okay? So this is for the tough. Now, this chapter is intended to be a little rough because Joyce is giving us a parallel to the pains of childbirth, and he's using that vehicle to put some other ideas out there. So there needs to be a little pain. Just like with Wandering Rocks, there was confusion and people bumping into each other, and Joyce even included the reader in that and had us crash into a few things. He wants us to have a little pain in this episode as well, and certainly there is a little pain here. If you started reading it, you know what I'm talking about. So let's get started. Now, if you see me looking at notes, I got to have notes to get us through this one. I've been thinking about how I'm going to present this, and I think I have some good ideas for you. And so I'm looking forward to getting this stuff out there, but I need to stay with the notes because it's a very complex episode, and this could run to a 3-day video if I'm not careful. Stay on point. All right, let's get going. Let's start, as we always do, with what's happening in the Odyssey. Now, in the Odyssey, the guys are getting pretty worn down at this point. They've lost a few over at Scylla and Charybdis, and the guys have been at sea a long time. They're just wearing out. They need a break. They have supplies that they were given by Circe, and Circe's the witch, and we'll talk about Circe in the next episode. The ship is stocked, but the guys are worn out. They're exhausted. They're tired of sailing. They need a break, and they see the island of Helios. Now, they were warned not to go there. Circe told them to avoid that place, stay away from it. But they want to go. They're tired, they're fatigued, and Odysseus relents, and they go there. Now, the big rule on Helios is don't mess with the cattle, the oxen of the sun. Now, it's the island of Helios, which means sun, and oxen of the sun, it's the cattle of Helios. It's the guy that's in charge of this island, so we're not to kill the cattle. Odysseus says that we're going to go there, we'll rest, but we will not, under any circumstance, mess with these cattle. They go to the island. They've been there about a month. There's no wind. They're stuck there. They're languishing on this island waiting for favorable winds, and the guys are overtaken. The remaining crew members are just overtaken by this crazy hunger. They just want meat. They want a barbecue. They want to put on a barbecue, right? Despite Odysseus's warnings not to kill cattle, they are getting a hunger for these cattle, a lust, you might say. Odysseus takes a nap. He falls asleep, and while he's asleep, the guys kill the cattle and have this big feast. Odysseus comes to. He's appalled. He chews them out and says this is awful. He's having a big struggle trying to stop these guys from feasting. Helios is PO'd. They're ordered off the island. They depart, and as soon as they're gone, Helios calls down this big storm on them. Their ship is destroyed, and all the crew is lost. Everybody dies, except for Odysseus, who did not partake in any of the eating of this cattle feast. He lashes himself to the mast, and what's left of the ship makes it to the island of Calypso with Odysseus tied to the mast. All right, so he's the last survivor. They're all dead now. Nobody makes it off the island but Odysseus. So let's see how this plays out. Joyce made this statement in letters that he himself felt that in the Odyssey that the cattle were a symbol or a representation of fecundity. How can I say this delicately, because there may be students, but as be fruitful and multiply, right? The cattle are a symbol of that fruitfulness, fecundity. Maybe, maybe not. That's Joyce's interpretation of the Odyssey, but certainly he intends for the cattle to play that role in this chapter. So when you see references to the cattle, the oxen, the livestock, think about that we're talking somewhat about the fecundity of the civilization in the metaphor of the cattle. Now, that said, Bloom has just come out from a nap after his experience on the beach. He fell asleep, he took a nap, took a rest, and now it's about 10 o'clock at night, maybe a little later, and he feels that he wants to stop and see how Mina Purefoy is doing at the laying-in hospital. He knows she's been in labor for 3 days, so he intends to go there and check on her and see how she's doing. So, in the episode, we want to see, does Bloom kill any livestock? And I think you'll see that, no, he does not partake in this slaughter of livestock as the other guys are metaphorically doing. And notice their coarseness of their conversation and their lack of empathy for what's happening with Mrs. Purefoy. So, as I say, it's about 10 o'clock. Bloom's had a nap. He goes to the laying-in hospital, and we get this kind of weird language at the beginning. Now, Joyce has chopped this chapter up into 9 sections to give us a representation of the gestation process of human beings. 9 months, all right? So he's breaking it into 9 pieces, and he's showing us the gestation of the English language, that it's evolving from the earliest Latin Vulgate up to the present modern day birth of slang, and we'll come to that in a bit. But we see the whole evolution of language through each stylistic maneuver that Joyce puts us through. Now, these jumping stylistics can be a little bit tough. I encourage you to go back and read it slowly. Now, it seems like I'm saying that every chapter, but I think this book is meant to be enjoyed, digested, savored, relished. I mean, we're going to eat with relish, right? So Joyce wants us to take our time and really get a grip on what's going on. Now, if you do that, I think you'll find you'll be able to figure out how this chapter unfolds. You'll be able to understand it. You'll know what's going on, even though the language is a little quirky as it develops from the very early stuff. And the very early stuff is meant to be that sort of egg fertilization, sexual height, chaos stuff. So it starts out with this chaotic act at the beginning, and give us womb fruit, which means, may this come to fruition, and then we go from there. So you can see the symbolism there. It's obvious, I think. So think in those terms, that he's giving us a gestation, well, I'm going to struggle with that word, of the English language in 9 chunks as it evolves. And if you have a medical understanding, and people have done this, you can look in the commentaries where they've drawn parallels to each of these sections and what is going on with the fetus at that time. I don't think that's necessary to get all into that stuff. I don't even think it's that important, really. I think what's important is that he is stylistically doing something interesting here for a reason, and we'll come to that reason in a second. But he's giving us the evolution of the English language. He's giving us a parallel to the Odyssey with the Oxen episode and the references to cattle that are throughout. He speaks of the fecundity and in relation to cattle. And he shows that the other guys in the room, when he gets up in the hospital, up into the room where they're all drinking and loud and boisterous and joking, we see that there is no respect at all for the pain that Mina Purefoy is going through. So they're slaying the cattle in that sense. They're showing no respect for this process. So we have the evolution of the English language, and we have this metaphor. So that gives us our, remember back in the early chapters we talked about that birth, life, death cycle. We have that theme again, that there is the birth, life, death cycle. That's part of this, certainly. But there's more to it than that. All right, so we have from the early Latin through Mallory, Oliver Goldsmith, right up to modern day, or at least late modern day for them, late 19th century writing. So we see the full evolution, and by the end, it's kind of choppy slang stuff. All right, so from the very basics of English all the way up to modern. So we see this cycle. Now, why? Why do this? Well, first of all, Joyce wanted to show us that he could, because he was that kind of guy. But there's more to it than that. We've talked about this Irish literary revival, that they want to reach back to the old language and revive the old Irish and the old Irish tradition and the old Irish way of speaking and the language and all that stuff. Joyce shows us that language is an evolutionary process. It's always going forward. Art goes forward, despite other things, despite the views of the society, despite the views of people, despite reigning theology or philosophy. Art progresses forward. And he wants us to understand from this that as we see the language modernize, that there are reasons that the language modernizes. Also, he's trying to show us that with each style, there is a built-in philosophy that comes with it. Now, I gave this a lot of thought, and this is tough stuff to express. He doesn't want us to go backwards, because going backwards with the art goes backwards with the thinking. Now, as we talked before about, the romantic views, the halcyon days, the parodist, that was giving us that kind of crazy sense of when we get wrapped up in that stuff and start going backwards, where that goes. Now, in this episode, he's not parodying the styles. These are not parodies. There is one parody, but you'll find that these are not parodies. He's using the styles to express the action going forward. He's not making a parody here. It's not comical. There is a section where it does go into parody, but the bulk of it, no, these are not parodies. And a lot of commentaries say that he parodies each style. They're not parodies. I think it's more accurate term would be mimicking. He mimics the various styles through the ages. Now, what he wants us to understand as he tells you what's going on through these various styles and advances the action, it's kind of hard. You have to stop and think about what's going on. And there are fewer words, and words have fewer connections, and so it's harder to express concepts as you go backwards, particularly complex stuff. And each stylistic thing has with it a built-in philosophy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, think about trying to write a science fiction novel in Shakespearean English. It wouldn't make any sense, because Shakespearean English is rooted in that time period. It's rooted in the 16th century. It's there. You can't talk of anti-gravity machine and ray guns and flying saucers in Shakespearean English. It would be bizarre. It might be an interesting experimental novel idea for somebody to try, but I don't think it would be very successful. It just doesn't work. And that's what Joyce wants us to get from this, that these stylistic things are part of an evolution. In terms of the birth process, Mina Purefoy has been in labor for 3 days. Hard. She can't just quit and say, I don't want to do it anymore. It's always got to go forward. And that's what Joyce wants us to get in this parallel, that it has to go forward. There's no choice. You must go forward. You cannot go backwards. You can't be in the 6th month of pregnancy and say, this is good, I like it here, I think I'll just stay here forever. You can't do it. And you can't get to the 9th month and say, well, I like the 6th better because it wasn't painful and I don't have this birth thing facing me, and so I'll just go back to month 6 or 3, back when I fit in my jeans. It doesn't work. You can't do it. And he wants us to get that. I think that's an important concept. That's an important idea in this chapter. Okay? Now, let's get into some other material here. Let's talk about the action. What happens? Bloom goes to the hospital. He's met at the gate by this nurse who lets him in. They talk. Some small talk. He asks about a doctor that they both know. She says that the doctor has died from stomach cancer a few years ago. Bloom's sorry about that. Notice that the language is rather glossed over and flowery. Not the way we might express that today. I think that goes to a point that I was expressing a second ago about the style trapping the expression. That if you fall back to the old style, you can't say it the way you would say it today. That the way she speaks of the belly crab, but he had a most peaceful death. Well, I've never heard of anybody dying from stomach cancer that had the most peaceful, blissful kind of death. I think that's more of, again, stylistic, right? So let's keep that in mind. Now, he runs into this guy he knows who invites him up to the party that they're having. And Bloom goes to the room where the guys are all drinking, they're all partying. And this is where he's, at last, in the same room with Stephen. Okay? So our characters have finally united. Now, they've crisscrossed a few times, but now they're in the same room. They're not just passing through rooms. They're in the same room together. Bloom thinks about Stephen. He looks at him and he sees him getting drunker and drunker, and Stephen spouts off a few things, and Bloom thinks of Stephen's waste, the waste of his talent and his health, that he's wasting himself on drinking and prostitutes. Now remember, this is before antibiotics, so there's a little risk along with this. It's not just like, not good, but there's some health risk with it, and many people died from the consequences of encounters with prostitutes. Diseases like syphilis were not treatable, and so people had eye problems, madness, all kinds of stuff, and that perhaps Joyce had some of that going on himself. We don't know with certainty. Possibility he had pretty serious eye problems. We don't know what the cause of those were, but we're talking about a time before antibiotics, and so Bloom looks at Stephen and sees this waste. Joyce gives us a little taste of each style, as I said, and he shows us that he can mimic these styles. He can do it. All right. Now, I want to tell you a little story about me. Back in high school, when I was in high school, there was a book that was very popular called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Yeah, you can look it up. I thought it was trite, but it was very, very popular at the time. And it's about a seagull that is obsessed with flying higher and higher and higher. He goes way beyond all the other seagulls, and then he does these crazy dives, like from outrageous height, and he builds up this tremendous speed and gets a rush from it. And he's risking his life, but he's doing this thing that no other seagull can do. Now, my teacher in high school thought this book was just the greatest thing in the world. I thought it was trite. And we had a writing assignment in this class, and he asked the class to get a newspaper, pick a story in the newspaper, pick a news story, and then write a story about the story. Okay? Had to be a couple of pages. It had to be pretty fleshed out, but he wanted a story about a story we found in the paper. I told a friend of mine that I could do this in an hour, and that I would get an A in it, that I just knock this out and get an A. I pick up the newspaper, and it's Groundhog Day. And they mentioned a groundhog going up to see his shadow. So I wrote the story of Benjamin B. Groundhog. And this groundhog refuses to go with the other groundhogs up to see his shadow. They're all getting excited. Groundhog Day is coming. They're all, getting haircuts and getting ready to go, and they're all excited, and they start massing up at the opening to the hole, and they're all ready to go, and then Groundhog Day comes, and they all rush up. But Benjamin B. Groundhog says, no, I'm not going to do it. I refuse to do it. And all the groundhogs rush up, and he refuses. Well, I banged that out in less than an hour, got an A. The teacher liked that story so much that he used it in subsequent classes. I think the rest of his teaching career. I had several people contact me and say, hey, I had Kerry's class, and he used your story, your groundhog story, because he always gave credit, and he used that story for years. Now, I was not making a parody. I was more mimicking the Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and I was subtly pointing out to my friends that the teacher was a bit of a sap, really. I wasn't making a parody. Parody would be clever and humorous, and I didn't do that. Maybe it was clever, but it certainly wasn't humorous. But I mimicked the Jonathan Livingston Seagull story to show the teacher how vulnerable he was to that sappiness, because he bought into this seagull business. He thought that the Benjamin B. Groundhog thing was great, and he was kind of blinded to that. And that was really my point of the whole exercise. So this is what Joyce is doing with these chapters. He's not making, or these little sections, he's not making parodies. All right, I'm kind of repeating that too much, but he's mimicking the style. He's showing that he can write in that style and deliver the content. However, with that with that style comes certain philosophy, and you can see those philosophies wrapped around the axle of each of those styles. So go back and pay attention to that. Okay? So what about these styles? What do we get from this? Now we get another view of Bloom in this episode. We certainly get a pretty good look at Stephen. We get an outside look at Stephen that we haven't had. We've had these introspective looks, but now we get an outside look. We get him in a social setting, drinking, trying to fit in. He says some things that are kind of stupid, and I'll cover those in a second. And we also get a view of Bloom. And Bloom is kind of invisible. Bloom is, again, the outsider. We've had other views of Bloom. We see how his friends see him. We know somewhat how Molly sees him. We know how his friends see him from the funeral episode and how they treat him and what other people say behind his back. We know what the citizen thinks of him because we've had the encounter with the biscuit tin. We know what Gertie thinks of him because she's fantasized about this dark, foreign stranger, right? So we have all these kind of weird views of Bloom. Now, in this setting, he's practically invisible, right? Bloom is there. He's not the butt of the jokes. He's just there. He's there, sort of. He's just there. He is the wandering Jew. He's traveled Dublin. He's here on a errand of mercy, as it were. He cares about Mina Purefoy, and he's there for her. He's there out of compassion. We see the drinks are flowing. Bloom keeps getting a full glass, and he's pouring his drink into other people's glasses. He's getting rid of it. He's not drinking. He watches Stephen get drunk. There is a little conversation, and there's a thunderclap, and Stephen is shaken by it. And we see Bloom explain the phenomenon. Now remember, Bloom is the phenomenologist. Remember that from I can say that, but I can't say gestation. Isn't that weird? Okay, so what do we see going on here? We see a lot of drinking, a lot of raucous guys. We see a lot of cattle being slaughtered in a metaphorical sense. These guys are also making light of the whole birth process, right? They're joking about it. In fact, there's a fellow there that is the one that's he's trying to buy contraceptives because he's going to hook up with Millie, Bloom's daughter. And he's there in the room, and Bloom doesn't realize it, and he realizes later when they go off to the pub that was Millie's father back there, and he makes the connection later. But he's out to get condoms. Basically he's trying to get contraceptives so he can mess around with her. So there's just no respect at all for what's happening with Mrs. Purefoy, with the whole life cycle process at all. In fact, somebody yells out, death to the cows, and they're talking about the foot and mouth disease, but it could be the same. They could be speaking about, because the only thing these guys think about in the sexual context is their pleasure, not anything to do with, what's happening with birth and what that life cycle is all about. They don't give any consideration for that. In fact, there's none for Mina Purefoy, who's in labor, and they're partying and drinking and loud, and the nurse has to come and ask them to hold it down several times. So they don't care about that. Now, when we hear that death to the cows, Stephen thinks about the letter that he has from Deasy, that there is a solution to this foot and mouth disease, and he brings it up, that there is a cure. We can cure this, because they're thinking of just kill off all the cows, which is our parallel to Oxen of the Sun in Odyssey. But Stephen is reluctant. He stands for life, and he says, no, there's a cure for that. We can and they're nonsense, and they kind of put him down for it. We see Bloom and Stephen emerge on the same side. They end up on the same side of this argument. All right, so we see Bloom as a guy who's there on a mission of compassion, and we see Stephen nervous about the way they're treating things, and he tries to bring it up, and he's shut down. The baby is born, and we have Bloom thinking of the relief and the celebration of life, while the rest of the guys are talking about pleasure, birth control. Mulligan makes some pretty crude remarks about him being the fertilizer of, that's a business he's going into or something. That's his job. He's going to be the traveling fertilizer. So we see this crassness mixed around this kind of sacred event. Now Joyce is not a wacky sentimentalist, because we've raged against that sort of sentimentality. But he is talking about language and art and literature and respecting that and that going forward. And that's what he's chipping away at here. That's what he's trying to get us to understand, that this chapter is on the gestation of the English language and the birth of the English language. And the importance of that, and the sacredness of art. I have that line that I use, that humanities makes us human. This is what Joyce is telling us. This art is evolving. It's going forward, and it's birthed. Okay, so we don't want to shove it back in and go backwards to this Irish literary revival. We don't want to revive a dead language and pull up dead styles and go backwards. We want to go forward with art. That's what he's telling us. Now, we have a couple of kind of weird things. Stephen pulls out this money and he says, I've made money on poetry. We know that that's not the case. We know that Stephen has not made that money on his art, on his writing, on poetry. He's teaching school, and today was coronation day, payday. He got £3 and something, and he's already blown off almost a third of a whole month's salary already. And did he give it to his starving siblings? No. Has he done any good for anybody? No. He's drinking it up, and Stephen has already spent nearly a third of a month's salary on drinking already in this day. And he's boasting that he's made this money from his poetry. Now, we know better, and that's not true. So we have these other guys boasting of their prowess, their sexual pleasure, and all this kind of ugliness that's going on here, noise and drinking and boasting. And then Stephen jumps in with his boasting, and we know that's not true. Now, who's the hero? Bloom? Well, we know that Bloom is also not, there's not going to be any stone casting here, because Bloom is also not without his own stuff. He's just come from the beach where he's pleasured himself on the beach to a young girl, so he's not perfect. Nobody is perfect in this episode, and that's something that we really want to see. Now, Joyce is leading us to what I consider the grand climax. I think that Circe is the height. That is the crescendo of the book. That is the trial. This is where we're going to look at the foibles of the society and of Bloom, and we're going to see, how does this guy come out, and does he survive, and does he bloom, or does he wither? And what happens with he and Stephen, and where does it all go? I believe that's all hits its major crescendo in the next chapter, Circe. But right now, we see the stage being set for the trial. There's accusations all around, right? So there's nobody is heroic. we get late in the chapter after the birth, we get this sort of glorification of Mina Purefoy's husband, Theodore. And what a great accomplishment, what a wonderful thing he's done. Well, what has he done? You know, his contribution to this whole thing is pretty minimal. But this is his 9th child. You know, it's another trophy on his altar or mantle. And what has his contribution been? We know what life in Dublin at that time is like. We know that the guys are not going to take a lot of responsibility. He's probably just another drinking, partying guy. He's a second-rate clerk at a bank or something. He's not, you know, an up-and-coming guy or anything. So I'm sure that their family is struggling to make ends meet and eat. So he's not the hero. Cattle certainly are not the hero. Are women the hero? Well, they're certainly heroic. But the hero? There goes my lights. Well, this has been an exciting episode. I've had the lights go out. I'm getting windows are popping up saying there's no sound. It's been exciting, and maybe I'm already at Circe. So let me wrap this up, okay? I didn't intend for this video to go so long. It's just hard to get it all out there. So as we get a little further along, the guys are drinking. I think you can follow all that. If you read it slowly and pay attention, you can tell what's going on. That the guys are talking sex and they're drinking. That's pretty easy to understand. Then we have the birth. We have the only true parody is the glorification of Mina Purefoy's husband, Theodore. We get that whole sense of what a hero he is. The parodist does come back for that one, so I believe that's a parody. The other ones are not parodies. They're mimicking a style for a reason. All right, so he's trying to show us the language, and I want to illustrate that here in a second. So as it winds down, Stephen leaves, the guys leave, they're off to Burke's, another bar, do a little more drinking. They're going to consume absinthe. Now, absinthe is a green alcohol stuff that supposedly is so wacky that it induces hallucinations. It was actually banned in the US up until fairly recently. I believe it was legalized sometime in the late 70s. I should have looked it up. Maybe somebody can put it in the comments. But absinthe was actually banned in the US, not prohibition. It was banned for it being a hallucinogen. So it was considered to be that intoxicating. Okay, so Stephen's doing that now. So he's had beers and whiskeys, and he's consumed a third of his monthly pay already in a few hours, and now he's off to drink absinthe. So you know he's going to be whacked. So Bloom, out of concern, he knows they're all off to another bar. He knows Stephen is plowed, so he's going to follow him. So Bloom sets out to follow these guys, and they're off to do some more drinking. We get the heroic thing about the Purefoy's husband, and that I think is the only parody, and you'll easily recognize that. At the end, what happens when a baby is born? What do you get? You get wah, you know, slap, 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 wah, wah. And then you get, you know, cough. They try to clear the lungs. They slap them. They cry, and then every orifice opens up, and you know, right? So Joyce gives us a sort of birth at the end of the language. We have this sort of infant at the end where the language gets kind of choppy, interspersed with blah, blah, blah. And we have the pronouncements of the prophet Elijah at the end, and he starts to, you know, make these things. It's basically a talking brochure. Remember the flyer that Bloom threw away? The flyer begins talking, so we get the first kind of hallucination there, and he starts to rattle off some stuff, and then we hear this retching, ah, ah. And maybe that's, could be Stephen throwing up. We don't know. There's all these guys are drinking. They're all pretty plowed. And so we get this we go through this from the very beginning. That's that Latin Vulgate stuff, which is kind of a pre and during conception stuff, right through the gestation of the English language, through to the birth, and then we get this sort of puking, retching baby with the choppy language at the end. This is it. This is our product. But now we have to continue to go forward with that. So that's the final language. That's art. Art mimics life, or art indicates life. There's an expression about that. Art is life, something. The humanities make us human. That's the one I like. And Joyce is telling us the importance of the language going forward. And we have to keep going forward, and it's still infantile. We're still in an infantile stage. Okay, so let's not go backwards. Let's continue to go forward. Now, I like to end these with some thought-provoking stuff. So let me bring up something here. Who is the real hero of this episode? I raised that question a moment ago, but who is the hero? Certainly not Stephen, not Bloom. Kind of comes up a little short on this one because he's not perfect, though he is the phenomenologist and he's there on an errand of mercy. He's got his foibles. He can't stand firm and say, yes, I stand for women and fatherhood. As a father, there's a guy in the very room who is going to be doing his daughter, and his son is dead, and his wife is having an affair, and he's just finished pleasuring himself on the beach. He certainly is not a pillar of fecundity. We can't say that Bloom represents everything that is marriage or wholesomeness or the proper view of the sex act or any of that stuff. He's not any of that, but he is a good guy. Stephen fails because I'm the poet and look at the money he's lying and he's drunk and he fails. The guys around him certainly are not heroic in any sense. Buck Mulligan is a jerk and he's not a hero. Purefoy's husband, that the parodist gives us as the hero, isn't heroic by any standard. His contribution to all this is pretty minimal. Women, are women the hero? I don't think so. I don't think there is enough material about them to be heroic. It's kind of consequential. There's talk about, there's a little section where they talk about choosing between the life of the mother or the baby when there's, complications. And, the church commands that you let the mother go and save the baby. And Stephen makes a crack about, one in purgatory and one in limbo. In other words, you lose them both. They both die. You're trying to save this baby and you let the mother die, and, and then that's when the thunder comes and he's kind of scared by that he's blasphemed. But women are just doing what they got to do. So who is the hero? Well, I think Joyce is telling us that language is the hero and art is the hero. We don't want to stifle that. We don't want to stifle language and try to pull it backwards. We've gone through this period of gestation where it's developed and evolved, and this is where we are now. We don't want to go backwards. Develop it. And I believe that's the core that he's trying to give us, that art is worth it and art is the hero. And his art is language, and he demonstrates his fluency with this art. He's good at it, and he knows it. And I believe that Joyce is holding up to us the value of language and art as that is where the salvation is. That is the hero of the episode. Well, think about that. I'd love your thoughts. Put them in the comments. I hope that this is enlightening. Thumbs up would be appreciated. And I'd love to hear from you. This episode is very difficult to talk about because it's so intense, but I think you get it. And I hope I've added something to you and to your understanding of it and made it more pleasurable. I think by this stage, you're going forward and we're going to make it. We only have a few chapters left. They're interesting. The next one is pretty rough, but we'll get through it. And then it's smooth sailing. You're going to do it. You're going to achieve it. And you're going to understand what Joyce is trying to tell us. Now, I wanted to read something. This is from the last chapter. This is some of the most beautiful assemblage of words. Now, you can pick this book up. You can pick this book up, go to just about any page and start reading and get some phenomenally beautiful prose. But this really strikes me, and I think this is what Joyce is trying to say. You remember how the previous Nausicaa chapter, how it begins? The summer evening had begun to fold the world in its mysterious embrace. That is the most beautiful description of sunset that I think I've ever read. That's what he's trying to tell us. There are greater things ahead, folks. Thanks.